Few guidelines. Number one, photography is permitted on this tour. We encourage it. It's, however, not permitted in the special exhibitions, which you can visit after the tour is over. But we do ask that you turn off your flash drive. This is to help us preserve the artifacts in the museum's collection. And also for the same reason, please don't touch any of the artifacts. Also, we will be covering sensitive material on this tour. So if at any point you need to take a break, we understand. You can just take off your headsets, turn down your volume, and then rejoin the tour when you're ready. And it's where the majority of the museum is located. That's because this is where the remnants of the original World Trade Center is located, at their original foundations at bedrock. And you're also going to be encountering the full sizes and dimensions of the Twin Towers. Now, the Twin Towers were 2 of 7 buildings. The world changed, and 9/11 is still the defining event of our times. And on that day, 19 terrorists from the Al-Qaeda network hijacked 4 commercial airliners to use as weapons in a coordinated attack against highly visible symbolic United States landmarks. 2,977 people were killed that day. This represents the single largest loss of life from a foreign attack on American soil, and the single largest loss of life of non-military rescue personnel in American history. And it all started at 8:46 a.m. This is when hijacked Flight 11 was crashed into the north face of the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Then 17 minutes later, hijacked Flight 175 was crashed into the south face of the South Tower. Then at 9:37, hijacked Flight 77 was crashed into the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia, headquarters of the United States military, located just across the Potomac River from Washington, D.C. And at 10:03, hijacked Flight 93 was deliberately crashed into a field outside of Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Are you all familiar with the story of Flight 93? Most of us are. This was the only one of the 4 hijacked planes which did not reach its intended target. That's because there was a 30-40 minute delay in departure of that plane. That meant it fell out of sync with the other hijacked planes. So after the hijacking, passengers and crew members placed phone calls to loved ones and authorities on the ground who told them what was happening here in New York City and at the Pentagon. And knowing the probable fate of their plane, those passengers and crew members decided against all odds to try and retake that plane from the hijackers. And as they were storming the cockpit, the hijackers deliberately crashed that plane. Now, only minutes earlier at 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed in about 12 seconds. And then a half hour later, at 10:28, the North Tower collapsed, again in about 12 seconds. And all of these events occurred in only 102 minutes, such a short amount of time, less than 2 hours. And many of you will probably remember, wherever you were, whether you were in New York City like me or watching it on television, or if you're young, you've seen the footage. That was a beautiful day. It was a cloudless blue sky, like a late summer day. And that's, in fact, the first thing that people generally mention when they're recalling their events of 9/11. And you see the beauty of that day in the photograph right across the hall. That's going to be our first stop. So if you'll follow me, we're going to gather in front of the line before hijacked Flight 11 came crashing into the North Tower. That's the tower with the antenna on top of it. And that broadcast antenna also points to the development of communication technology by this time. This was the first time in history that a major portion of the world's population witnessed a major terrorist attack and its consequences live in real time. An estimated 2 billion people on the planet witnessed September 11th happening as it occurred. And we refer to this as a global community of witness. Many of you are probably part of that global community of witness. Now, the next part of the museum we're going to walk through is called the Soundscape. We're not going to stop there, but you can come back after the tour if you want to spend more time there. And in the Soundscape, you're going to hear the voices of people from all over the world recalling their memories of 9/11. You're going to hear different accents, different languages. One person will start a sentence, another person from another part of the planet will complete that sentence, and that really points to this shared commonality of the experience. You may recognize, as I do, many sentences which reflect my experiences of 9/11. So as I said, read panels. All of these photographs were taken in New York City on the morning of September 11th, not very far from where we're standing right now, and they show people reacting to this catastrophe that they were witnessing in front of their eyes, just happening. It was a quarter of a mile in the sky. You see all those different reactions, from anger to sadness to pure shock. And it's important to remember that this is the authentic site. This is the place. This is where the Twin Towers stood and where they collapsed. This idea of authenticity of place is very important to the museum, as envisioned by the architects Davis, Brody, and Bond. This idea that you're not going to a museum to find out about things that happened far away, that you are where 9/11 happened in New York City. So we're now going to start our descent down the North Memorial Pool on the plaza above, which you probably saw on your way into the museum. And we're standing below the bottom of the waterfall at this level. And behind the walls here, these silver walls, are all the pipes and pumps and other mechanicals which push nearly 500,000 gallons of water through the North Memorial Pool. Both of these pools are the largest man-made waterfalls in North America. Now, if you'll come here to this ledge here, what you're looking at are the box column remnants. These are the remains of the foundations of the North Tower. They mark its footprint or its outline. We'll be talking more about the box column remnants later on the tour when we're down in Foundation Hall. But for now, we're going to continue down this ramp and facade of the North Tower, which was directly impacted by hijacked Flight 11. Now later in the tour, we'll be talking more about impact steel when we're standing directly underneath it. But for now, just have a look at this, and you really see frozen into the first terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. Yeah, those of you from New York will remember that February 26, 1993, a group of terrorists who were not members of Al-Qaeda, but who shared a very similar ideology and were related to those who would go on to carry out the 9/11 attacks, detonated a rental van packed with 1,200 pounds of explosives at the B2 level, the parking garage underneath the North Tower. You see this plaque right here on your left? That marks the approximate epicenter of that blast. Now, the terrorist intentions were to make the North Tower into the basement levels, and it sent smoke and fumes up both of the Twin Towers, forcing their complete evacuation. And over 1,000 people had to be hospitalized because of smoke inhalation. Now, you can find out more about the 1993 bombing attack in our historical exhibition after the tour. I'll be pointing out the entrance. To your right, you see scrolling digital projections of the missing persons posters. Those of you who were in New York on September 11th and shortly thereafter will remember, as I do, that the entire city of New York was covered with these posters. They were on every available space, on storefronts, mailboxes, fences, churches, hospitals. They were everywhere. And they were placed by family members and friends who were desperate for information on their missing loved ones at the World Trade Center. And it became clear very soon that faces of people who did not come home on 9/11. But something you may not know, a lot of people don't know this, estimated 14,500 people were able to get out of the Twin Towers and flee to safety. The next artifact we'll be looking at enabled escalator to your right staircase on the far left, you can see the top of it, the white part of concrete. That's the top of what we now call the survivor stairs from World Trade Center 5, one of the low-rise towers on the complex. And that overhang proved crucial to the approximately 200 people who were able to get to these stairs and evacuate to safety. It's very important to remember that even those who were able to get out of the towers faced a second deadly danger, that of the rain of heavy falling, burning debris from the impact zones. That overhang protected those 200 people. That overhang also protected people when the South Tower collapsed, raining more debris down and rendering the plaza impassable. So we're actually going to be descending alongside the survivor stairs. You can take the escalator to your right. Later, survivors and preservationists realized how important these stairs were as a symbol, and they lobbied to have them saved using the National Historic Preservation Act. The stairs were saved. However, they needed to be moved from their original location because of construction that was too. North Tower volume, where the North Tower once stood, which you saw from the ramp, that silver volume, and the South Tower volume, where the South Tower once stood. And this gives you, again, a sense of how enormous these structures were. And you also see how close together they were, only about 130 feet apart. We have many ways of honoring the lives of those people who were killed. We have our memorial plaza with our pools, memorial pools above. We have a special exhibition in the South Tower volume called In Memoriam. You may be able to see the photographs on the wall there. You can see photographs of nearly all of the victims, and you can also use digital interactive tables to find out more about their past, their families, their goals, their personalities, their hobbies. And in many ways, this is perhaps the best way of honoring these people. Not just remember how they died, but to remember how they lived. And another way we memorialize is through works of art. You see two on the wall behind me. First, you see this quotation, "No day shall erase you from the memory of time." This is from Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid, and it captures the mission of the museum, which is to remember every single person every single day. You notice the surface of the lettering is rough. That's because all of these letters were forged from recovered World Trade Center steel from Ground Zero. This was done by a New Mexican blacksmith named Tom Joyce. And surrounding the quotation, you're looking at 2,983 individually painted watercolor panels. This is by a New York-based artist named Spencer Finch. And every single one of these panels is a unique shade of blue. This is to honor the unique personalities of every single victim. And it's also meant to evoke the color of the sky on September 11th, which you remember from the photograph at the beginning of the tour. And that blue sky was in many ways the perfect backdrop for the awe-inspiring, iconic Twin Towers themselves, which for 3 decades dominated the New York City skyline. They were a symbol of New York City itself. Everybody knew those towers, regardless of whether they had ever been in New York or not. Everybody knew them from television, movies, postcards. And the next artifacts we'll be looking at will help us talk more about the Twin Towers, about atop the North Tower, as you saw from the photograph above. This 5% fragment is about 20 feet long. It weighs 38,000 pounds. And just consider that the original antenna was 360 feet tall. So enormous that it would not have fit inside of this museum. You see this panel here, there's a black circle indicating the portion of the antenna from which this comes. Now, the story of the antenna is interesting. When they completed the Twin Towers in the early 1970s, these were the tallest buildings on the planet. And as you've seen from the silver volumes, they were really massive in area. And there were some unintended consequences. Namely, they were interfering with radio and television broadcasts coming from other antennas in the area, most notably the one on top of the Empire State Building. So the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which owned the site and built the Twin Towers decided to place this enormous antenna on the top of the North Tower. This was completed in 1980. And this antenna was so powerful that even after Hijack Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower, some transmissions continued to go through. Television, radio, and by this point, cell phone transmissions as well. At 10:28, when the North Tower collapsed, obviously all transmissions ceased forever. Faced a challenge of how were they going to get the nearly 40,000 people who could be working in the Twin Towers on any given day up to their floors in a timely fashion and without taking up too much floor space with elevator shafts. So this was the first building ever to borrow from the New York City subway system. This idea of express and local trains was applied to the elevators. And I don't know if any of you were able to visit the Twin Towers before 9/11, so you will remember that at the ground floor you would take an express elevator up to sky lobbies located at the 44th or the 78th floor, and then you would transfer to a local elevator which would take you directly to your floor. And these elevators were marvels. These were the fastest, most advanced passenger elevators the world had ever seen. And for those of you who remember taking those express elevators, especially if you went up to the observation deck at the top of the South Tower, Windows on the World, the restaurant at the top of the North, you were there in a minute. These elevators traveled at 1,600 feet per minute, faster than a floor per second. However, these elevators, which were so crucial to the daily functioning of the Twin Towers, proved to be a great liability on 9/11. When the planes struck the towers, elevator cables were severed. And this meant that many people were trapped in the elevators. Estimated 200 people were killed because they were trapped in elevators. However, there were some notable exceptions, and there's one famous story about a man named Jan Demscher. I don't know if you've heard this story. Jan Demscher was a window washer at the World Trade Center, and he was trapped with 5 other men in an express elevator at the 50th floor of the North Tower. And Jan Demscher had the presence of mind that he took out his squeegee, and he used the blade of the squeegee to pry open the doors of the elevator. And then he and those 5 other men took turns with that squeegee, literally scratching through 3 layers of sheetrock. They were able to scratch through that elevator shaft wall. They broke into a bathroom on the other side. They cut a hole about 12 by 18 inches. Each man squeezed through individually, and all 6 men were able to get out of the North Tower and flee to safety only about 5 minutes before the building collapsed. This is an incredible story. And I also want to let you know that you can see Jan Demscher's squeegee handle in our historical exhibition, which I mentioned earlier. The entrance is right across the way through the truck. We're actually going to be moving along the left-hand side along the wall. I'll tell you a little bit more about this truck. You're looking at the front of the ladder truck, by the way. And because of falling debris, the ladder, which once extended 100 feet into the air, has been completely bent over. The cab has been almost completely shorn off. Now, Ladder 3 was one of the first of the over 225 fire companies to respond to the Twin Towers on 9/11. It's because they're located in the East Village, about 10-15 minutes away. And Ladder 3, as were over half of the responding fire companies, was what we call the normal. 9/11 happened in the morning, so the night shift firefighters were getting off work, the day shift firefighters were coming on to work, and when they found out what was happening at the Twin Towers, they all came down. Ladder 3 was also captained by a man named Patrick John Brown, known as Patty Brown to his colleagues. And Patty Brown was one of the most highly decorated captains in the fire department's history. Very beloved figure. He was known for taking in firefighters who had problems at other firehouses because he had this policy that you had a clean slate when you walked into Ladder 3. He said, just show me what you can do now. So people really loved this man. We know that Patty Brown and members of Ladder 3 made it up to the 35th floor of the North Tower by 9:21. And this is carrying over 60 pounds of equipment on their back, walking up the stairs. We know this because even though Patty Brown's radio wasn't working, as were many of the radios used by the firefighters that day, Patty Brown was able to find a working landline telephone on the 35th floor. And he placed a call to Fire Command. He said they were helping numerous injured civilians to get out of the building. And his last recorded transmission was, "We're still headed up." We don't know how high up they made it, but they were trying to get to the impact zone. They were trying to rescue as many people as they could and trying somehow to respond to those fires. All 11 members of Ladder 3 were killed when the North Tower collapsed. And this is 11 out of 343 active duty firefighters who were killed that day. This represents over 4,000 years of experience in the fire department. A total of 441 first responders' lives were taken in New York that day. This also includes 37 Port Authority police officers, 23 New York City police officers, and dozens of others. Everything from emergency medical technicians to FBI agents. And you've probably noticed the fire helmet in the glass case that I'm standing next to. This is Patty Brown's lucky helmet. He wasn't wearing it on 9/11 because he had taken it in for repairs, and his family later found it in the trunk of his car. And this helmet stood in as his surrogate in a special memorial service held in his honor on November 9th, 2001 at St. Patrick's Cathedral. That memorial service was attended by over 1,500. After the collapse of the Twin Towers, it just gives you the smallest sense of the devastation. You see the fire truck there? That's this truck. It's Ladder 3. Nobody expected this. Now this piece of steel once ran from the 96th to the 99th, the bottom there. That's where the nose of hijacked Flight 11 directly pierced the building. That's why the steel is bent back. This piece of steel and 200 others were studied by the National Institute for Standards and Technology. It's a government agency tasked with investigating how the towers collapsed. And they determined the following. Number one, the force of the impact of the hijacked planes meant that many of the supporting columns on the periphery and in the core of the towers were either severed or badly damaged. Also, the force of the impact of those planes meant that the spray-on fireproofing on the structural steel was essentially shredded off. All of those hijacked planes were transcontinental flights chosen by the terrorists because they had the maximum amount of fuel on them, about 10,000 gallons of fuel apiece. When you mix 10,000 gallons of jet fuel with oxygen and building materials spread out over multiple floors, you had fires raging, which reached temperatures of over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, this is not hot enough to melt steel, but it is most definitely hot enough to weaken unprotected structural steel, and this is what began to happen in the impact zones. First, the floors made of a lighter weight steel began to weaken, and they began to sag down. And as they sagged, they pulled on the broken and weakening support columns in the sides and in the core, and those columns began to bend or bow in. And finally, with the weight of the intact building above the impact zone pressing down, those bowing support columns eventually buckled, and that led to this progressive collapse, floor by floor, of the Twin Towers. The North Tower collapsed in 102 minutes. September 11th began with hijacked Flight 11 crashing into the North Tower, ended with the North Tower's collapse. However, the South Tower, which was hit afterwards, collapsed first. It collapsed in under an hour, 56 minutes. There's two main reasons for this. Number one, the plane which hit the South Tower was traveling at about 100 miles per hour faster than the plane which hit the North Tower. That meant greater damage to those support columns. Also, that plane hit about 20 floors lower than the plane which hit the North Tower. That meant there was much more weight in the intact building above the impact zone. It pressed down much harder and led to a quicker collapse. And with the collapse of both of these towers, these enormous, iconic towers were reduced to 1.8 million tons of debris, which fell all over this area and fell on this area where we're standing right now. And that debris also fell on the next artifact that we'll be visiting, which is the slurry, the hard rock underlining the island of Manhattan. Those trenches would then be filled with a substance called slurry. That's why it's called a slurry wall. Slurry is a type of clay which held the trenches intact until they could be pumped full with concrete, reinforced with steel. Once the concrete dried, then they could start excavating the slurry wall, and they were bolted to bedrock underneath the Hudson River on the other side. This was to provide additional support against that tremendous pressure of the river. Once they built the lower levels of the World Trade Center, the basements, shopping center, the parking garages, those lower levels provided that lateral support, and they could detention or cut the tieback cables. Despite the fact that nearly 2 million tons of debris fell on this wall, amazingly, at no point in its 3,500-foot length did this wall break. It was damaged, but it did not. The wall is so much more than just a wall. It became a very important symbol for us, and we all needed our symbols. A symbol of not breaking in the face of this horror, of not falling apart, of staying strong. And it was determined that this wall needed to be part of the new World Trade Center site because of its symbolic importance. This inset section you see right here, 60 by 60 feet, this is the only portion of the original slurry wall that you can still see. It's because it, like the survivor stairs, is an historic asset protected by the National Historic Preservation Act. You see these walls on either side with the smooth concrete. This is part of a new reinforcing wall that was built right next to the original slurry wall. It wraps behind this inset. That slurry wall is still there behind this wall. It holds pride of place because of its enormous significance. They tried to wrestle it loose so they could take it away with all the other hundreds of broken, damaged columns, but it wouldn't move. More debris was taken out, brought in heavy equipment to try and pry the hundreds and hundreds of broken, destroyed columns. This one alone remained rooted to bedrock. It wasn't going to go anywhere. And that's when it took on its special significance as a symbol of not only fortitude, but also of solidarity. And were found in the rubble, trying to recover remains and trying to remove these nearly 2 million tons of debris. It's also when the markings started to appear. You notice at the top it says PAPD and the number 37. That stands for Port Authority Police Department. 37, the number of their colleagues who were killed on E3. Below that, Fire Department of New York, and that horrible number, 343. You see also in the middle of the last column, the spray painted letters and numbers. SQ41, that stands for Squad 41 of the New York City Fire Department. E214, Engine Company 214. L111, Ladder Company 111. These were spray painted by members of those companies who were firefighters were found by the last column. You also see all of the photographs, posters, the badges, the prayer cards, and other mementos left to honor the people who were killed. Now, because of the importance of this column, it was determined that this would be the last piece of structural steel to be removed at the end of the 9-month rescue, recovery, and cleanup period. And you see at the bottom of the column all of these signatures and quotations. These were made at that time by some of those thousands of men and women who'd been working to clean up Ground Zero. And this was their way of testifying, of saying, I was here, I did everything I could. And the greatest testament to these men and women is the fact that they cleaned up this site in only 9 months. This is 2 million tons of debris. They thought this was going to take at least 2 years, and that tells you a lot about the sense of community, the sense of solidarity, of coming together to try and heal this horrible wound at the heart of our city. Now, on May 28, 2002, in a private ceremony held by the construction workers, members of the different trade unions took turns making very small cuts in the base of the last column to dislodge it. It was then placed on a flatbed truck. It was shrouded in black, covered with an American flag. And then you can see from the photograph right here on May 30th, 2 days later, in a public ceremony attended by thousands of first responders, family members, public officials, the site, as everyone stood in complete silence. And this marked the end of that 9-month rescue, recovery, and cleanup period. This was like closing a chapter, an important chapter of that 9/11 story. Regions, those corrupt rulers will fall and be replaced by Al-Qaeda leadership. After 9/11, the United States did not retreat from these regions. The United States went to war in Afghanistan. It's because the Taliban regime in control at that time had been harboring Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, offering them a safe haven and a base of operations for years. However, the fate of Osama bin Laden remained unclear. Some people thought maybe he was killed in the Afghan wars. Many others thought, no, he's probably escaped and gone to live in the mountainous tribal regions which link Afghanistan and Pakistan. They found him living in a 3-story brick house. You'll notice that brick in the case there to the right. That brick is from that house. They started no telephone and internet service. And then finally they started spotting a very tall, thin man who would nervously pace behind those Navy SEALs, Team 6. Camouflage shirt was worn by one of those Navy SEALs as he raided the house. They stormed the house. They found Osama bin Laden, indeed was there. He was killed, along with 4 others, including the courier. And later the Pakistani government had the house demolished. They didn't want it to become some sort of sick shrine for Islamist extremists. However, an American journalist named Dominic DiNatale was able to recover that brick, and he presented that to the museum. You also, I don't know if you can see them, there's 2 medallions in the center of the case. Those medallions were created after the raid and given to all those who'd participated in the hunt for Osama bin Laden. One side has the date of the raid off the top of the most wanted list. And those medallions were donated to the museum by the CIA operative who was crucial in tracking Osama bin Laden. Her code name is Maya. That might ring a bell if you've ever seen the movie Zero Dark 30. She's portrayed by the actress Jessica Chastain in that film. And she gave us. Osama bin Laden was found and killed. We're going to be returning to these were to be the tall building up. This takes up a lot of office space, rentable floor space. So the architect Yamasaki decided to place 50% of the support columns on the perimeter, on the facade of each tower. The other 50% of the columns were bunched together in the center or the core of the building. And you see these box columns, you see how huge they are, how thick they are, how close together they are. They helped give the Twin Towers that distinctive pinstripe appearance. And we're talking about buildings over 1/4 of a mile high. That's intense. These columns were so strong, and there were so many of them. This was designed to withstand the impact of a jet plane. That was part of the design. The towers disintegrated from within. And fragments had to be shorn down. That's where hijacked Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower. Family members placed flowers and notes, teddy bears, and other mementos directly inside of the box column remnants because that's all they had. And they were determined that these box column remnants be preserved for posterity. So family members worked with preservationists to have meaningful access to them as well. So we are about to round this corner. One of the most solemn aspects of the 9/11 story is its unresolved nature. Today, nearly 14 years after the September 11th attacks, approximately 40% of the remains are still unidentified. This wall marks a physical barrier between the museum and a special facility run by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner of New York. Behind this wall is a special temporary resting place, a repository for those remains. It's not part of the museum. It's only accessible to immediate family members. Family members requested that their loved ones be at the site where they were last seen alive. However, with advances in DNA identification technology since 9/11, and in large part because of the commitment of the Chief Medical Examiner to identify every single person, identifications are continuing to be made. It's a very slow process. However, the latest identification was made in March of this year. A young man named Matthew Yarnell, 26 years old. He worked for Fiduciary Trust in the South Tower. He was finally identified and finally reunited with his family. And you all can imagine how crucial this work is, how important this is for those family members. So before we end the tour, I just want to once again point out other places in the museum that you can visit. Most importantly, the historical exhibition. The entrance is right behind you, underneath the blue lettering across from Ladder 3 truck. In Memoriam is located in the South Tower volume, where you can find out more about the lives of the people who were killed. There's also a video installation in the South Tower volume called Rebirth at Ground Zero, which shows you time-lapse photography of the rebuilding of this area, the building of the memorial pools, the museum, and all of the new skyscrapers that you see going up around us. And just on a final note, those 19 terrorists in Al-Qaeda, their real goal was to terrorize us, to freeze us in terror, to scare us, and to pull us apart. And they failed. And we see this from the fact that over 3,000 first responders came down to the Twin Towers after the attacks. Many of them volunteer, retired from other cities. We see this in the thousands and thousands of men and women who worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to clean up Ground Zero in only 9 months. And we also see this today in the fact that millions of people come to this site every year from all over the world. They come to see the memorial pools, come to the museum, or visiting our brand new beautiful skyscrapers. The Freedom Tower is completed. You can go up to the observation deck. And you all are part of that community of millions. You're not scared. I'm not scared. We're still here. So just want to leave you with that thought. And I want to also thank you all so much for coming on the tour. And if you have any questions whatsoever, please let me know. And I'll also take your audio devices at this time. Just once again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.